Hello everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is the cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Avatar going up against Titanic. That's right, the 25th anniversary of Titanic is among us, and it is released in now 3D, more premium 3D, transferring from James Cameron, lover of all things 3D, destroyer of all films, because everyone else is going to want to follow, at least in the midst of the $2.2 billion of Avatar 2, again, much of which is thanks to the higher than average ticket price because of people going to see this film in IMAX 3D, in 3D, in all the other premium formats, because people wanted to actually see this film on the biggest screen possible. That's not a dig against the movie, it's just a statement of actual fact. It is interesting, though, that the media continue to run with this false narrative of saying, hey, worldwide charts, this film is up there with Titanic, and we're going to go ahead and just try and say Avatar 2 is the biggest film or one of the biggest films of all time. Here's the problem. These films, as I've mentioned previously, and trigger warning for anyone out there who gets triggered by this word, inflation is a very important thing that needs to be taken into account, because the dollar today does not mean the dollar that it meant, the dollar today is not worth the value of the dollar that it was back in 1997. And so what I'm going to do today is hopefully be able to explain to people why it's so important and why it's such a good and really the best metric that we ultimately have in the midst of not having an actual centralized system that tracks all individual ticket sales. And so hopefully that will help make a lot of sense. We also, of course, had the release of a brand new film this week. We had Magic Mike's Last Dance coming at 1,500 screens, coming at the #1 spot, but really not all that much higher than Avatar 2, which has now been out for quite a long time. And also Titanic, again, after 25 years, coming in the top 3 films of the weekend. So we'll be talking about this. We'll be doing also an update on the box office comparison of the domestic total for Top Gun Maverick versus that of Avatar 2, as right now those are the two films competing for what is going to be the highest grossing domestic release of 2022. Obviously, the crown for worldwide number is clearly in the hands of Avatar The Way of Water, but the domestic crown has yet to be decided, as this film is still making some money and has not reached the $718 million that was made by Maverick in its release. And so we'll go ahead and talk about all of these things as well. Before going any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, slap that fire button if you're watching on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with the bell notification on that you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. And also, I want to give a chance to be able to shout out the Wednesday Raven Awards. It's the award show that I host now. This is going to be the 5th annual Wednesday Raven Awards, just the Raven Awards for short. It is my Oscars boycott because the Oscars are stupid. They're awful. They tend to not really give praise to the best films of the year, and also they have obviously no interest in talking about some of the worst things that happened in film or pop culture in the year. And you get all of that with the Raven Awards. And thank you very much to the 199 people who have already responded to this ballot. It's going to be open for a little bit less than a month still, as we're going to probably close it around March 10th to prepare for the Raven Awards. It's going to be the same night as the actual Oscars themselves, and so it is going to be a lot of fun, and it tends to be every year. It's been a lot of fun, and it's just great to be able to boycott the Oscars. So if you have not voted yet, go ahead and get those votes in. Again, this is already the highest number in recorded Ravens history, and so continue to add to that number. Let's get into those 200s. All right, let's go ahead and dive into these numbers. So as you can see, the main headline from Deadline: Avatar tops $2.21 billion global as Titanic resurfaces and retains #3 berth on all-time worldwide chart international box office as the latest re-release of James Cameron Titanic 3D. Again, very, very important number there, and very, very important metric to understand why the film has made as much money as it has, at least in its re-releases since it was post-converted to 3D, has moved the big boat movie to $2.21 billion globally, meaning it still stands at the #3 worldwide release of all time, right up in its wake. Cameron's Avatar Way of Water has now reached $2.213 million, still the 4th biggest movie ever, and less than $4 million away from Titanic. And hold the phone there, no. If we're talking about raw numbers, sure, but raw numbers are not actual reality. Raw numbers do not account for actual ticket sales. Raw numbers do not actually account for inflation. And so we're going to talk about why this metric continues to be stupid. And again, if you get triggered by the word inflation, I got news for you. And it's not good for your love of Avatar 2 over a film like Titanic or other films that from the past are just, again, much more successful on paper. Not just because they have a higher number when you adjust it for inflation, but also because of what that tells us a little bit more, and how it tells us a little bit more about the actual number of tickets being sold to that movie and the number of people going to see that film, because ultimately that is what judges the success of a film or at least the overall success as far as records are concerned. Records really should be concerned with adjusted for inflation numbers, or at the very least, try to figure out exactly what the average ticket price for a given film in a given year would be to be able to get that accurate number. And so let's go ahead, though, and talk about some of these numbers of the release, and then we'll dive further into that can of worms when we get to the Avatar numbers. So as you can see, Magic Mike's Last Dance making $8.2 million, opening in over 1,500 screens. Interesting that they did not release this film more widely. My guess is, and my thought is, that because it is the Super Bowl weekend, and this is probably one of the worst box office weekends we've seen in a very long time, very much because it is the Super Bowl weekend and everyone's focused on that, is that maybe Warner Brothers is holding this film back a little bit, hoping that, okay, we'll, release it in, another 1,500 screens or so. Think of this almost as like an initial opening night of saying, okay, let's just try and get some positive buzz around the film. Steven Soderbergh's back, so it's going to likely be a pretty well-made movie, as Soderbergh tends to make very good films. It's one of the reasons why I did actually like the first Magic Mike film, because it was promoted as a beefcake film, ended up being a lot more than that, whereas the second film seemed to instead go and lean more heavily into the beefcake mentality. This film, with Soderbergh, again, being marketed in a very similar way to the first film, but ultimately Soderbergh is a very talented filmmaker, so we'll have to wait and see how, I would be interested in seeing the movie, except for the fact that I, as a completionist, would need to see Magic Mike XXL, and I really don't want to watch that movie because Soderbergh was not involved with it, and so therefore it likely is just all beefcake, and I have no interest in that stuff. So anyway, Magic Mike, though, could potentially see a resurgence next weekend, if indeed that is their plan, if they're going to try to have this film be a big, release for the Valentine's Day weekend, right? Whether or not they're going to try to maybe expand this out on Valentine's Day or expand this out by the very least the weekend. It'll be also interesting to see how this film does up against a film that might try to get some people, at least in the similar age demographic, as we do have Ant-Man Quantumania coming out next weekend, which is definitely going to dominate the box office and take that #1 spot. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the film is going to be able to recoup, because right now, 8.2 million domestically, and how it's performed with about 10 million or so internationally. Not a very good start for this Warner Brothers release. Warner Brothers just has not had a lot of luck with their releases, but we will, again, of course, recheck with this one next week, because it is indeed a weekend that could potentially not be telling the entire story, similar to what we saw with both Avatar and Puss in Boots for the weekends that those films got, released, and then their second weekend numbers, right, being lined up right with Christmas and New Year's as well. Right, and then it ended up being a big difference, because if you looked at the other parts of the holiday frame, those films actually did very, very well. Puss in Boots especially was able to get very positive word of mouth and do stronger and stronger every single time, and even go upwards in percentage, whereas Avatar Way of Water has been seeing consistently very small drops percentage-wise, and that's why it's been able to stick around for as long as it has. Coming in the #2 spot is indeed Avatar Way of Water with another $6.8 million, and only a 39% drop there, though it's looking, based off of these numbers and based off of its daily numbers, it's looking like this film is running out of steam. So I would say $700 million at this point might actually just be a cap as far as the highest likely chance, or the highest number that it likely will make domestically. And again, obviously, we still have a lot of theaters, and we still have, millions of dollars being made by this movie. But the fact that the film has already dropped below $1 million per day, and it did that several days, in fact, this past week, tells me that this film is indeed starting to lose some of the steam. And with large films finally on the horizon to bring this actual competition, not just domestically, but also internationally, like Ant-Man Quantumania, not that I'm expecting that film to be the biggest film in the world, but still a lot more than the other films that have been released since Avatar. Definitely going to be interesting to see those numbers. Titanic, in its 25th anniversary in 3D, made $6.4 million. Again, a lot of that's because this film was released exclusively in 3D. Some screens actually were even in IMAX as well, and so obviously that does raise the average ticket price. There are a lot of people who like Titanic who are going to see the film too, right? So it's not like no one's going to see it. It is obviously a lot of people going to see it, but that higher than average ticket price definitely does help account for a higher number here. Again, that's not a dig against Titanic. That's just talking about the numbers and the facts of the situation. And very, very impressive for a film that is 25 years old to continue to do numbers like this, especially after having several re-releases. Coming in #4 is 80 for Brady. About 80-year-olds thirsty for Tom Brady. At least that's how the trailer presents itself. Making another $6 million here, adding 27 screens. This film in its second weekend of release, though, dropping 53%. So yeah, not the best result, really, that this film could have. But this is yet another film, just like the #6 film, Knock at the Cabin, that we will go back to next weekend and see if we see a very much, a smaller drop than expected, or maybe even an increase from this weekend because of the whole situation of this film going up against and having to compete with the, at the very least on its Sunday numbers with the Super Bowl. But really, if you think about people, preparing for the Super Bowl, celebrating the Super Bowl stuff, that tends to take up the entirety of the weekend. And so there's no surprise that this weekend has been so terrible as far as the actual overall box office is concerned compared to previous weeks. But Knock at the Cabin did make another $5.5 million, a 61% drop there, bringing its total domestic to $23 million. It's interesting that 80 for Brady is actually doing better domestically than Knock at the Cabin. I would say in Knock at the Cabin, having seen the film, is definitely not all that great. It's not a terrible film, but it's also not that great because it's incredibly predictable, and the performances, especially from Bautista, are leaving a lot to be desired, and overall it's just not that fun of a movie. Again, I like thrillers and I like movies like it, but at no point did I care at all about really anyone who was on the screen. 80 for Brady at the very least looks somewhat interesting, I guess, but not really. Kind of crazy that 80 for Brady is still in the top 4. So top 5 really of this weekend. Puss in Boots though is expected to, when the actuals come in, right? You can see right now for the weekend they're projected Knock at the Cabin and Puss in Boots to be at $5.5 million. I suspect the reason why the 6 and 5 are in the positions that they are in are either 1, a clerical error, or 2, they expect because of the drop off being much less for Puss in Boots, and also because of the likelihood of it just doing better in general, especially since it's much more well received, even though it's been out for a very long time. Likely will end up when the actuals come in being higher than Knock at the Cabin. It'll be interesting to see where those numbers do hold, though, when those get updated sometime on Tuesday. A Man Called Otto coming in the number 7 spot from Sony. They're in a 38% hold there, so again, doing as well as it can for a film like that movie, I guess. Missing from Sony Pictures, another 30% drop there. This film, though, was able to make its money back, and so not making a whole lot of money, but still making money nonetheless. Coming in number 9 is Megan, $2.3 million, a 38% drop, so still hanging around. And the film Plane making another $1.1 million, though, obviously you can see Lionsgate very much pulling this film from as many theaters as it possibly can, as the international audience, though it has helped in its overall numbers, has not helped enough to make its money back. And so this is a movie where the jury's still out of whether there will be enough international cash to help it out. Magic Mike's Last Dance was able to make $18.6 million worldwide. So again, jury's still out on this one, whether or not the Valentine's Day itself will help, or whether the Valentine's Day weekend, people are extending it out, the post Super Bowl weekend, or whatever you want to call it, whether they will be able to make things up there, even though it will be going up against the juggernaut that will be in the next Marvel film. I still don't think that Ant-Man Quantumania is going to be the biggest of the Marvel films, though, because it is Ant-Man, and those films have never been the biggest performers as far as those films are concerned. But still, it's going to easily take the top spot, I would imagine, based off of especially what has been early in their projections. Now, let's talk about Avatar a little bit. So $2.2 billion. This film is very, very impressive. As you can see, according to the reported budget, again, given to us here by the numbers, $460 million, 4.8 times that budget. That is very impressive, right? That means that this film has made its money back in spades. Now, of course, this $460 million is not accounting for what James Cameron has indicated the film needed to break even. So again, I'm going to go ahead and open up that can of worms again if you want to dive down it. So again, whether you like it or not, James Cameron, the filmmaker himself, indicated that somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion, again, somewhere in that range, was its break even. So clearly this film made its money back. Clearly this film made a lot of money. The question is, how much money has it made back? And exactly, what will that mean for the future of these films going forward? Clearly, the international audiences are eating this film up. The domestic audiences also, right? This is going to be at the very least the second highest grossing domestic film of 2022. But the question really is going to be, is it going to be able to have enough steam going in the years ahead? The reason why I bring this up, and especially why I bring this up in regards to the domestic box office, is because this film is indeed slowing down quite a bit, right? It does not have the same type of longevity that even a film like Top Gun Maverick had. Now, of course, I will give that credence that Top Gun Maverick was a summer release, and so it was probably easier for it to be able to perform much better for a longer period of time. But the fact that last several weekends we've seen Top Gun Maverick's weekend numbers also be able to beat out also be able to beat out Avatar shows us, right, that there is obviously a difference as far as the long range, connection. So both films very successful nonetheless, right? Whatever comes in 1 and whatever comes in 2, both films are going to be box office successes and are box office successes, but it is interesting to see these two films go up against each other because, as you can see, now the difference is only about, maybe $9 million between the two, and based off of the numbers we're seeing here of, again, the film being well over $1 million per day, not dropping in its first 10 weeks below $1 million, again, it's not until like week 11 or 12 that it finally dropped below $1 million on a daily number, whereas, as you see with Avatar 2, this film dropped $300,000 below $1 million on its 8th Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday, right? So we're seeing a full week essentially of below $1 million day performances. So based on that alone, yeah, it's looking like Top Gun Maverick is going to hold on to the domestic crown. And this film, I think, would be lucky enough to get to $700 million domestically. Again, I say lucky enough, not because its film's not doing well, but because, again, in the comparison between the two, Top Gun Maverick had a lot more steam going for it. Now, the other thing, too, that I wanted to dive into a little bit is the comparison between Avatar, Way of Water, and Titanic. Obviously, that is what was brought up here in this article from Deadline, right? It says, number 3, number 4 spots of all time. Now, I'm not taking into account the other films on that list, right? Because we would be having to take pretty much every single film that's being reported as being the number 1, the number 2 highest grossing of all time. We would have taken that off, right? And the reason why I go after that list, right? And the reason why some people have this perception that I've only done this for Avatar, but I've done it for other films too. It's just that you didn't care enough about those films to really say anything about it. So anyway, just wanted to put that out there. But now we have James Cameron versus James Cameron. So one thing, interestingly enough, is that when you adjust the numbers for the reported budgets, Titanic cost $399 million, Avatar Way of Water $460 million. Just insane how much money these films actually cost to make, though of course they were able to make those returns. If you look at the worldwide total here from the numbers, this again does have to have the caveat that this includes all of the releases that were coming out of Titanic. Titanic has had several re-releases, and so I knew that that was something that some people probably would try to bring up. So, hey, I raised you Box Office Mojo, which gives us the original release. So domestically in 1997, the film originally made $600 million and then made $1.2 billion internationally for a total worldwide of $1.8 billion. Now, what I did was I went ahead and took these numbers, right, and decided to say, okay, let me see, what would the rate of inflation look like, right? What would a dollar today look like back during 1997? And so that's where I came up with this little charting right here. And so first off, right, this is at $644 million now, right, because this is the most updated box office domestic. So obviously that is the only number that's not accurate on here. But again, it's an extra $20 million. So yeah, Avatar 2 is doing very well. But when you adjust even against Avatar 2, right, compared to when that film came out, the dollar today would have been worth $1.41 back in 2008, 2009. And so based on the fact that that domestically made $785 million, it made $1.1 billion in today's dollars. You go back to Titanic in 1997, that dollar, again, the dollar today was worth 1.87 back then. That would bring it up to $1.1 billion. So you recognize that, okay, wait, something is not quite right. You're talking about these being the biggest films of all time, and yet when you actually look at the numbers themselves of what they would be in today's dollars, you realize, no, there's a lot less people going to see these movies today. And this would include Top Gun Maverick. This would include all of the Marvel films, the DC films, all of the major releases. And I think that that is something that definitely needs to be talked about. Not to mention, I decided to add on, even on top of that, what the entire worldwide numbers would look like in that original run. The original run for Titanic, James Cameron. So people going to complain, hey, guess what? I'm taking a James Cameron movie. James Cameron fandoms fighting amongst themselves. $3.4 billion, right? That's, again, $1.8 billion as the original number was in the original release of the film. And then you compare that to the fact that the dollar today was worth 1.87 back in 1997, and therefore you get $3.4 billion worldwide. Now, some might say, well, what about the exchange rates and stuff like this? Well, here's the problem with that. That's already been taken into account because guess what happens when you report the box office numbers? You report it, and it's being reported here on these websites in dollars. So it's being reported in dollars. Those exchange rates are already being taken care of then. And so then, because you're given it in the dollar, you only have to account for the inflation of the dollar itself. It's amazing to me that people just don't understand this. What is also interesting, though, is this actually does give credence to Avatar 2, because what it shows us is that, adjusted for inflation, guess what? The original initial release of Titanic, nothing compared to Avatar Way of Water. Avatar Way of Water's domestic opening was $134 million. When you adjust for inflation, Titanic was only 57.2, so still a strong number, but this film obviously had a much richer life, a much stronger life in its long-term forecasting, or its in long-term performance domestically and internationally. But again, just putting those numbers out there because it is, again, the original numbers, taking from the original release, taking, again, from the actual accounting of inflation. This also, if you want people, how did I get the dollar today is worth X amount in this year, X amount in this year. I use an official government website, put in, okay, $1 in 1997, what does that equal today? $1 in 2022, what does that equal then? And so this is where we get the numbers as they currently stand right now. So I just wanted to put that out there. And so also we're able to get another interesting little factoid here. So obviously these are imperfect because we're taking average ticket prices for all movies. And so when it comes to Avatar 1 and Avatar 2, these have a much higher average ticket price than what the average ticket price for the year is, because these films were primarily released in 3D and premium formats. They didn't have the premium formats or the 3D technology really to the same extent when the first Titanic came out. And so that's why, again, using the average ticket price of 4.59 is a bit more accurate than the Avatar 1 or 2 numbers. But anyway, I digress. These numbers also come from thenumbers.com, which again is taking the total domestic made in its initial run and then comparing that to the average ticket price. And so I will, of course, try and do a deep dive to see if I can find out exactly if there is any metric whatsoever of the average ticket sales and average ticket price of those sales for Avatar 1 and 2 to get a more accurate number. But anyway, as you can see, the reason why I adjust for inflation, why it's so important is because of this fact itself. Titanic. All right. When you look at the total domestic, right? So remember that when we look at these numbers and we have to take these things into account, right? That these numbers are insane. And so, of course, I'm going to go ahead and people might say, well, hey, wait a minute. In your charting, you're comparing this to C5 and C5, that is the adjusted number there. Okay, well, let's go ahead then and take this again. Let's make things fair. All right. Guess what? 130 million tickets. So you're looking at an extra 32 million tickets that were sold for Titanic over the first Avatar film. That's a big difference. And again, this number is probably actually lower because this is just compared to the average ticket price for the year of any movie and not just of this individual film. So it is interesting nonetheless, and I think it's important nonetheless, to be able to keep those things into account and to also be able to recognize that's why I adjust for inflation. Because it's the only real way to understand where films today really stand up and stack up against the films from back in, just even 10 years ago. Because the value of the dollar has changed so much, but also there is no centralized system of ticket sales. If there was, this would be so much easier. It'd be so much easier to say, okay, this has the highest, this has the lowest. And I'm sure there might be some sites out there that have actually done the legwork on that to figure it out. But again, because especially now in the last 10, 20 years, you've gotten the development of so many different technologies. And so the average ticket prices for, this is just domestic numbers too, are going to fluctuate depending on the movie. Again, insane stuff to say nonetheless. All right. Anyway, talking about some of the other films, 80 for Brady, $24.9 million. Knock at the Cabin, 36.7. Puss in Boots pushing to $400 million. Man Called Otto at 92.2. Missing at $26.6 million. The film Megan at $165.5 million worldwide. And Plane at $41 million. And again, it's making some money internationally, but not nearly enough to be able to make up for the losses that it is projected to be having at this point in time. Going to the charting, because we love to do some charting here on the channel, we can indeed make some projections for Knock at the Cabin and 80 for Brady. So if you look at Knock at the Cabin, based on the fact that it's made $36 million in the first 2 weeks, based off of historical standards, I'm projecting the film to make somewhere between $52.5 and $73 million when all is said and done. And for 80 for Brady, $35 million to $49 million. Now, these numbers also could be impacted by the fact it is Super Bowl weekend, so take those numbers with a grain of salt, similar to the numbers for Puss in Boots and for Way of Water, which again were easily chart breakers because of that fact, and also because they just performed that much better too. It's still interesting nonetheless. Now, also taking into account, right, even Magic Mike's Last Dance, $47 million there means the break even for Magic Mike's Last Dance is $117.5 million. Starting off 18.6, unless we see a turnaround on Valentine's Day and Valentine's Day weekend, the post Super Bowl weekend, it's not looking very good, really, for Magic Mike as far as box office profitability. But again, it's still within that territory where it could be saved by the time next weekend comes around. Based off of the numbers as they stand, though, I'm right now projecting Knock at the Cabin to make somewhere between $1.5 and $14 million. And so, again, probably will end up being on the higher end of that because of this weekend's numbers being lower. 80 for Brady's having a break even of $70 million means I'm projecting it to lose 20 to 12. But this film could also have a chance of breaking even if the film is able to do better down the line and if it's able to make up some ground over the course of this week and also over the course of next weekend, with it being a post-Super Bowl weekend. But all of this is to say it's also going to have to go up against some similar demographics, at least for Knock at the Cabin, more so than 80 for Brady. 80 for Brady obviously is going to skew older, whereas Knock at the Cabin is going to skew younger. Younger audience is going to be a lot more likely to go see a film like Ant-Man Quantumania, and so it's going to be interesting to see where that film ends when all is said and done. But of course, we will have these updates as the numbers come in and as we get them in going forward. We'll also have some box office previews coming up later this weekend. But just to end the video up, we're going to talk about some of the film's updates, right? So Megan, $41 million means the film currently right now is around, sorry, that's for Plane. Plane at $41 million is still $9 million in the red. So even though it has indeed doubled, and this is one of the reasons why I compare the first 2 weeks, because it shows you that those international numbers really did help out a lot. So even though it's doubled what it made in the first 2 weeks of its release, it's still around $9 million of a loss. And so could it make its money back? Maybe, but it's kind of running out of room at this point. Megan at $165 million is at $81 million in the black. And then as far as other films that I was actually able to update, Puss in Boots, over $100 million in net gain profit. Very impressive numbers for this film, but do got to call this film out because it is doing work in China, so millions of dollars did go to China. Though not nearly as many millions of dollars as Avatar Way of Water, with that $2.2 million based off of the projected $460 million budget, is $638 million in net gain profits. Though, of course, I will say that probably have an asterisk next to it, especially if James Cameron himself is to be believed, and depends on, of course, which day of James Cameron you are believing. So anyway, what are y'all's thoughts about this? Do you think that there is enough to be said that they should probably stop doing? Again, this is something that is done for attention. It's done for trying to say, okay, anything can be a record breaker at any point if you just, have it with the right comparison. That's why I really do wish that there was a streamlined way of us covering these things. And so that's why I think it is important to adjust for inflation, because I think that's one way of doing it, but also trying to break things down by ticket sales too, right? This might be something, if anyone has genuine interest in ticket sales, let me know and I will try and do some of the research to find out. Okay, obviously older films are going to be easier to find out the average ticket sales for those films because they didn't have as much technology to up the ticket prices overall for there to be much difference between individual films. But obviously this would be a lot harder, a lot more sleuthing would need to be involved in finding out, okay, what was the average price of a ticket specifically for Avatar 1, Avatar 2, or any of the major Marvel films or any major big budget films that have been released that have had films and theater experiences like IMAX, like 3D, like any of these technologies that do raise the ticket prices and obviously have a much bigger impact on those films compared to regular 2D film releases. And so let me know your thoughts about that. Titanic, any of these things I mentioned in the comment section down below. Also, if you've not voted in the Wednesday Raven Awards, please make sure you go ahead and do so. Check out the pinned comment below if you want to see more about that. You guys are all amazing. Hope you all have a blessed Sexagesima Sunday. Again, still in the season of Septuagesima as we prepare for the season of Lent. Hope you have a beautiful and wonderful rest of your Sunday. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Patreon, locals, and Subscribe Star members who are at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, starting off with Father Luca Illick, Garrett Searles, Chris from the 80s, who you can check out over on YouTube by the same name, Hymir Irie Hymason, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Hat Reviews, you can check out at his YouTube channel by the same name as well, Laura, the Modern Major General Story, Rosetta Allen, who you can check out at her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, which goes by the same name on YouTube. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on Patreon. And also for my Subscribe Star peeps, we got Matt317. Check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Fast Reaction, Mr. Roy, J-Rod the Beer Guru, and ZK-Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And also lastly to my locals members, starting off with Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, Brett D90, and the amazing lawyer Robert Barnes. Thank you all very much for supporting me for the month of February. You guys are all fantastic. If you want your name shouted out, access to exclusive podcasts, and exclusive giveaways, check out the top link in the video description below. Anyway, you guys are all great. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. And as always, God bless.